Hello and welcome to this tutorial on research design. You may have found yourself reading your course textbook and asking the question, what research design do I use? What does this tell me about internal validity, external validity, experimental control, and setting? Well, that's a good question. We're going to unpack this a little bit. Some of my students have encountered some questions and are trying to sort through the meaning of some tables they found in their course textbook that categorize research in terms of setting and field and internal validity and external validity. And they may have a hard time sorting this out. So let's look at a couple different ways of thinking about this concept. So this is a table presented by Hepner that's called the types of research designs classified by levels of external and internal validity. And then this is a table, they actually cited Gelso's work from 1979. So this is the original table that they based their work on. And this table is called a system for categorizing types of research strategies, degree of control of the independent variables. And then they emphasize that the internal validity question is related to manipulation of the variable. And then setting is the external validity question. We see that on the left. And then they categorize each type. But let's break this down and look at it a whole different way. We're going to use an oversimplification for explanatory purposes. And that is that the main idea here is that there's two aspects of research design, or two characteristics to consider, right? The first one is experimental control. And what does experimental control mean? Well, that addresses to what extent does the researcher create an experiment by controlling or manipulating the independent variable, such as random assignment to treatment groups or treatment and control groups. So remember, having a control group helps us control for extraneous variables or confounding variables like the time of day of counseling, the idiosyncrasies of the individual counselor, the office setting, whether it was too hot or too cold. But one thing to keep in mind is that Gelso recommended considering this a dichotomous variable, which means either or, just like with the hypothesis test. When we look at the alpha level, the 0.05 value or the 0.01 value to decide whether or not to reject or fail to reject a hypothesis, we don't really say something is approaching significance. We say either it is or it's not. It's either statistically significant or it's not statistically significant. So they're looking at this aspect of experimental control the same way. Either the experimenter is manipulating a variable for the study or they're not. So that is the first aspect to consider. Are they manipulating a variable? For example, are they saying, okay, let's look at the impact of this empathy training on counselors' emotional intelligence and attachment? Or are they saying, let's not manipulate a variable, let's just observe and survey counselors and see what their empathy levels are, or what the relationship is between empathy and counselor burnout? So that's the first dimension. So what's the second dimension of how they're classifying research design? The second one is setting. And that is the idea that field research lends itself to more generalizability than does lab research. So for example, if we go out into the field and go to a private practice or a community counseling center or a substance abuse counseling center where counselors are in the field, in the trenches, doing the work, seeing clients, and we do research in that setting where the counseling really happens, then we're more likely to be able to generalize that. If we're working in a lab where we're maybe having student volunteers and it's a different lab setting, we're not going to be able to generalize as much from that in most situations. So these are the two dimensions, so to speak, that we're looking at with how we identify or categorize research design. The first one is experimental control. So whether or not we're manipulating the variable. And then the second thing we're looking at is setting. Where is the research taking place? So for those that are visual learners, let's look at this visually on this on this illustration here. So imagine that there's an x-axis that runs across and a y-axis that goes up and down, but the line doesn't connect the two ends because this is a dichotomous decision. The experimental manipulation is not on a continuum. It either is manipulated here on the right or it is not. There's no middle ground here. So let's look at the right side first. So let's say, and this guy over here who is pointing his finger is representing guiding a client and directing a client through a particular intervention, maybe a mindfulness exercise or an empathy building exercise or communication exercise, something of that nature. That represents experimental manipulation. So when the experimenter is manipulating a variable, it's a high degree of experimental control. So this represents the counselor and the intervention being manipulated. Also, if you look at the top of the screen, you see an arrow pointing up, and this says generalizable / field setting, and there's a plus sign there. So this means on this end, you also have what's represented by a field setting. You see this picture over here on the right that shows a grief counseling office, and this is the place in the field setting where counseling may be taking place. So as you think about these two images, then you can think about, okay, well, this is a study where the variable is manipulated and the research takes place in the field. So there's going to be a high degree of experimental control and a higher degree of generalizability. The example I often think of is Bob Marvin's Circle of Security. He even has videos on YouTube where he's gone into people's homes and observed the behaviors of their children and their interactions between parent and child. And then he does his Circle of Security interventions. So this could be taking place in a field setting and including an experimenter manipulation, a manipulated variable of an intervention, that intervention being the Circle of Security. So in that situation, we would say there's high control and high generalizability. Okay, and then if we go down here to the bottom right, here on the right side, we're still on the right side, so that represents experimental control and manipulation. So there is an experiment, there is a variable being manipulated. But here we're on, we have the bottom arrow going down, meaning it's less generalizable. This is taking place in a laboratory setting. So here we have positive control because there's a variable being manipulated and the researcher's controlling that, but lower generalizability. What I think of here is, for example, Gottman's Love Lab. John Gottman has been able to identify what he calls the sound marital house. And these are interventions that are associated with longevity in relationships. So for example, one of them is fondness and admiration, and he's got activities that help cultivate fondness and admiration. So let's just say hypothetically he was going to run an experiment where he facilitated fondness and admiration exercises in the lab setting. So he would manipulate a variable and it would take place in a lab. So there would be a high degree of experimental control, but it may not be as generalizable as if it was taking place in the field, in his counseling office or in a private practice somewhere. Okay, now let's go over to the left side. And you can see over here, this is actually a picture, a screenshot of the video of John Gottman's Love Lab. So you can see there is a participant and there is someone from the research lab hooking up a device to her, and there's a microphone. So there's these different tools that are used in the lab setting. So here we have a variable that's not being manipulated per se. So let's say they're just observing a couple as they interact in the lab setting. So we have a low degree of experimental control because there's no manipulation going on, and a low degree of generalizability because this is taking place in the lab. So that's why you see the -C for low control and the -G because this is not as generalizable. Then if you look up to the top left of this illustration, you see that the variable is not being manipulated. And this is taking place in the field. So there's less experimental control, but more opportunity for generalizability. So here, where something's not being manipulated and it takes place in the field, I think about some of the tools that Gottman's used in his research and what James Cone out of University of Virginia has used in his research as well. The SPAF coding system, which is a coding system where researchers can code different behaviors. Gottman's been able to find the 5-to-1 ratio, for example. So couples that have positive relationships tend to have 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative, creating an overall positive emotional atmosphere. And so they could observe the couple interactions in a field setting, but not manipulate a variable. So just kind of look at the relationship or the correlation between those interactions and the longevity of the relationship. So that would be lower in experimental control because there's not a variable being manipulated, but higher in generalizability because it's taking place in the field. So this is another way to look at the different dimensions of generalizability or experimental control setting, and to think about these things about, with respect to your particular research topic. So you can think about, okay, do I want to manipulate a variable? Am I going to be conducting a study that's going to take place in the field or in the lab? And these are some questions to ask yourself as you are looking at which research design to use. I hope this was helpful for you. Thank you for taking the time to watch this tutorial, and may God bless you in your research.